Good evening. I'm Karen Burkhardt, the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. I'm honored to have been asked to kick things off this evening. Thank you for joining this conversation with Stuart Reid, the author of the Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination. The book will be released next Tuesday, but I have no doubt after enjoying tonight's conversation, you will want to pre-order it. We are delighted that so many World Affairs Councils are sponsors and promotional partners of this program. These include the World Affairs Council of Colorado Springs, Global Santa Fe, the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations. I want to especially thank the World Affairs Council of Connecticut for producing the webinar, with a special nod to Abby Noyes, who will be incorporating photos from this book into the conversation of what can best be described as a spy thriller. Stuart is the executive editor of Foreign Affairs magazine and a frequent contributor to The Atlantic, The New York Times, and many magazines and papers. He earned his bachelor's degree in government from Dartmouth College. Joining Stuart is Jim Falk, the host of Perspectives Matter, a McQuiston program. He is the president emeritus of World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth and the program chair of Global Santa Fe. We will be taking your questions during the program, so please type them into the Q&A function as they come to mind. And with that, I'll turn that over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen, and it's great to have the opportunity to be on this webinar with Stuart, and thanks to all of the World Affairs Council who helped promote the program. It makes such a difference. Stuart, congratulations. This is a great book. I've so enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. It took me a really long time to write it, so it's a great thrill to see it coming out into the world, and thanks for having me here.
And full disclosure, my father was posted as the regional medical officer in Kinshasa back in the days of the great rumble in the jungle. And so I've had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time there, and I can imagine just how difficult it might have been to get some of the interviews. And Zaire, now the Congo, is not a place where people necessarily go for a vacation. What got you to decide to take on this project, which I know took, what, 4 or 5 years to complete?
Yeah, 5, I think, but who's counting? So it actually
only a publisher.
Yeah, they were. It was actually a trip to Congo in 2014 that began the whole process for this book. I was there writing an article about Russ Feingold, who, as I'm sure everyone knows, was a U.S. senator from Wisconsin. He then lost his Senate seat and became an Obama administration diplomat to Central Africa. And so I was writing this sort of political story about former senator's interesting retirement choice or post-Senate career. But that got me reading about the Congo and its history. And the more I read, the more I realized there was this great, largely untold story. I mean, the Congo crisis, which we'll be talking about, was this moment where the Congo becomes independent, everything goes to chaos. This was front page news every day of the New York Times in the summer of 1960. I had barely heard of it. So I wanted to know, why was this such a big deal? What happened? And then the more I learned, it was clear that there were these fascinating characters, these larger-than-life men who were so complicated and interesting. And it sort of, the story, in a sense, wrote itself, because the characters drove the story.
And one of the reasons that I think this book is so interesting and flows so well is that you had access to some amazing archives, as well as cables that were, I guess, relatively recently declassified. Talk a bit about the process of, I guess, working through the Freedom of Information Act.
So actually, I did not file any Freedom of Information Act requests, because those take longer than 5 years, often like 10 years. And in fact, some of that work had already been done by others. But what I did benefit from was in 2013, the CIA finally declassified this big group of cables, operational cables about the details from Congo in 1960 and 1961. So that really allowed me to tell the story of just the day-to-day level of what the CIA was up to and who was doing what and telling what. So that was a big source. There were a lot of State Department documents that have been declassified, and then there were things that were never classified, or the UN documents. There were a ton of those that were very helpful. But I also wanted to get the Congolese side of the story, and so I relied a lot on memoirs, sort of obscure memoirs that Congolese politicians had written in French in the 1960s and 70s. I would track them down from a used book website. And then, as you mentioned earlier, interviews with some of the participants, and more often their children, because this has been 60 odd years. So combining all these different sources, my hope is that the reader doesn't really notice it. I want to keep the sourcing sort of in the background, and you can look in the endnotes to find out where a detail came from. But my goal is really to have a page turner and keep the reader interested.
Well, you did it. Do you feel that you were able to get access to all the documents, or put otherwise, do you think everything's been declassified? I think about the assassination of JFK, where every US president says, I'm going to release everything, but they don't.
So to my great dismay, there is still a ton of stuff that's declassified, that's not declassified, that's still classified, which, the US spends very little money on declassification. There are all these manual review processes. They take years and years and years. It's not a priority for anyone in the US government, which is a shame. And certainly for people writing histories is a problem. There's this one, the CIA wrote an internal history of the Congo operation. I know the title and the document. There's been a FOIA request for it years ago. Nothing's happened on that. So there's still a ton of stuff out there locked in the archives that I wish I had access to. A lot has opened up over the years, and we know the broad, we know the story, but there may be surprising details here and there if those are eventually declassified, which I hope they will be.
That I find that somewhat puzzling, because as we'll get into in a few minutes, what you do talk about and what has been declassified is pretty damning. It's egregious.
Right.
It really makes you wonder about what's there that they don't want to release.
It couldn't be much worse. You're right. But I think often the way the classification process works is it doesn't have to do with how embarrassing a secret is necessarily. It's more bureaucratic than that. It's okay, State Department and the presidential libraries, those have been better about declassifying. The CIA has been terrible about declassifying. So if your document is stamped CIA, good luck. If it's a CIA memo that circulated through State Department, you might have a better chance, something like that. So
no, you're
there are all
absolutely
these
right.
bureaucratic rules. I don't even begin to understand them, but yeah.
You're absolutely right. I did an interview, a book talk with a fellow who wrote a declassification engine. And if the State Department signed off and said they'd release it, that's great. But then if anybody else was mentioned, even if it were Department of Interior or Energy or whatever, they had to get a sign off. I don't want to spend too much time on King Leopold II, but I think it's important for our viewers to get a sense of how what is the second largest country in Africa came about being really, in a sense, his colony and not the colony of Belgium, where in the case of France, Britain, Portugal, it was a very different structure than how the Congo was first colonized. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so Belgium was created relatively late as a country in 1830. And so King Leopold II thought any proper European power had to have a colony. And he even had a paperweight inscribed with the slogan, Belgium must have a colony. And so he went looking for one, and he sent Henry Morton Stanley, this Welsh American explorer. He's most famous for allegedly saying Dr. Livingstone, I presume. He sent Stanley to the Congo River Basin in Central Africa and had him sort of buy up rights and force people to sign contracts where they didn't know what they were signing, and claimed the Congo for King Leopold. And as you mentioned, what was distinct about this was it was not like other colonies. It wasn't the French government that was ultimately in charge, or the British government, whatever. It was King Leopold himself. So it existed as his own personal fiefdom. And interestingly, one that he never in his life stepped foot in. He died never having visited the colony he cared so much about. So it was his personal fiefdom. It was resource extraction was the main goal. King Leopold's Ghost is an excellent book on this topic. And then eventually there were sort of the human rights abuses there were so egregious that Belgium was forced to sort of take it over, and it became part of the Belgian government like other colonies. And that was in, I think, 1920.
And one of the things that we'll see is that Belgium handled its colonies very, very differently. And let's just compare it to the neighboring country, Congo, which gets very confusing, which was it a French colony or a French protectorate? I believe it was a colony.
French colony, yes.
Yeah.
So France and Britain were, they had more colonies, and they also, it's important to point out, obviously, that it was colonialism. The local populations did not have much power. However, in French and British colonies, there were often these sort of proto-legislatures, where in French West Africa, now Senegal, there was a National Assembly there, and there were Senegalese who were also represented in Paris at the National Assembly there. So there were these sort of simulacrums of democracy in the other colonies. Congo had none of that. The Belgians forbade education for the most part until very, very late in the game. So there was no indigenous educated elite, really. Their whole plan, they had this slogan, no elites, no problems. The idea was the Congolese should be kept politically illiterate and inert, and then we won't have any problems. As the 1950s went on, this became an untenable position.
Let me read a quote that was January 13th, 1959. The King of Belgium was a radio broadcast in both Belgium and Congo. He said, "The object of our presence in the dark continent is to open these backward countries to European civilization, to call their peoples to emancipation, liberty, and progress after having saved them from slavery, disease, and poverty, to lead the Congolese peoples to independence and prosperity and peace." I think that paragraph really shows sort of I guess to use a phrase that we talk about here now, systemic racism.
Yeah, and paternalism, which was the guiding logic of Belgian colonialism. What was significant, though, about that radio address, so that actually came after what were called the Leopoldville riots. Leopoldville was the capital of Congo, now Kinshasa, as it was when you visited there. And in January 1959, the population completely rose up and destroyed everything. Massive riots took days to put down. Scores of Congolese killed, 0 Belgians killed. And that was really a turning point in the Belgian government's thinking. They look around, they see this unhappy population rising up. They look to Algeria, where rebels are fighting the French colonists, and they think, we don't want a colonial war. And so that statement by Baudouin, King Baudouin, the king of the Belgians, is today pretty tepid, but for the time marked an actual sort of new policy for Belgium in regards to the Congo. It was finally admitting that, okay, we need to kind of guide the country towards independence eventually. The date was unclear how exactly it would work, lots of details to work out, but by 1959, Belgium sort of saw the writing on the wall.
So when you look at, let's say, the independence of Tunisia or Morocco or some of these other countries, there was really a cadre of people like Habib Bourguiba, who was educated in Paris as a lawyer. And you saw that with many intellectuals from Algeria or many of the other countries, like the other Congo. But again, Belgium and the Congo was different. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about why that was. And I guess you've touched on it, but also describe what that term was, évoluer.
Yeah, so the motivating principle behind that policy, it was really back to what I said earlier, that no elites, no problems. There was this, and I think another way of putting it is Belgium was a little bit more amateur in running its colony. The French and the British just had a much more sophisticated apparatus, and I would say a more sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics. And they realized sooner than Belgium did that, the winds of change were coming to Africa, and you couldn't hold on to these colonies. They did many terrible things on the way out, to be clear. So one way the policy manifested in Congo, however, was that they did allow for an elite that wasn't political. So you mentioned the term évolué, which is literally, the translation would be evolved person. And this was an official status that the Belgian colonial administration bestowed on certain Congolese men who were deemed to have sort of European comportment. And it was this invasive process where an administrator would come to your home and look at your toilet and see, did you eat with a fork and knife? They would check whether your French was up to snuff. But this was a status for which many Congolese eagerly applied because it could get them advantages in their communities, in their workplace. And one of the earliest people to get this status was actually Patrice Lumumba. So that is one sort of weird aspect of colonial rule, is the official status of marking certain people as evolved.
Well, it's now time for us to talk about the star of the show, Patrice Lumumba. That's the prison. There we go. Let's stay with him for a second. Tell us about this young man who was, I think, lack of a better word, he was a heck of an operator.
That's well put, Jim. So Patrice Lumumba was born in 1925 in a small town in Belgian Congo, and he, sometime in his late teens and early 20s, moved to a city, Stanleyville. Today is known as Kisangani, and that's in the east of Congo. It's also where the movie The African Queen with Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart was filmed in the 1950s. Lumumba would have been in town at the very moment that was filmed, in fact. And so he moves to Stanleyville and gets a job as a postal clerk, working for the colonial administration, sorting mail, etc. He then gets caught embezzling money, and he did it. He admitted to it. He was stealing money. He claimed it was because he couldn't afford to live this Europeanized évolué lifestyle. He had, wanted to give his kids good food, wanted to send them to the right schools. He had magazine subscriptions. But Lumumba was also, he was a real autodidact, a voracious reader. Because educational opportunities were off limits, he within that system, he achieved a remarkable degree of learning. And as you said, he was a real operator. His real skill was, I'd say it's twofold. One, political organization. There was no one like him who could, campaign and organize and get registered voters and print pamphlets. And then also he was extremely charismatic. Even his bitterest foes admitted that he had a silver tongue.
How long was he put in prison for the embezzlement?
About a year.
And where was that?
That was here in Stanleyville Central Prison. And, the conditions were terrible. And he complained about the food. Interestingly, his status as an évolué gave him certain privileges. So that was another way where the Belgians created this hierarchy. So he was, I think he got to wear pants rather than shorts, and, had slightly better food. There were things like that. And in prison, he read and wrote a lot. He was permitted access to a typewriter and books and used that to his full advantage.
So we know there are many paths to politics. How did he go from prison and the sort of life he had? You've touched on it, that he wrote a lot, but what was the big defining point that made him, in a sense, one of the key leaders of the movement towards independence?
Yeah, so he finishes his time in prison, reinvents himself, has to leave Stanleyville. The administration hates him there. And so he goes to, Leopoldville, the capital, the center of power in the Belgian Congo. And he can't work for the administration. He's disgraced, having been, caught embezzling, and he becomes a beer promoter, selling a particular brand of beer. It's almost like there was an equivalent to the Pepsi versus Coke rivalry in Leopoldville at the time, and he worked for the newer upstart. So I guess Pepsi, if I have that right, equivalent, but in beer. And so, and this took advantage of his organizational skills, his speaking. He would sort of tour the town, go from bar to bar, and try and get people to drink his beer rather than the rival beer. And in that environment, that was also that we're talking the late 50s now, 57, 58. And that was when the Congolese really awoke politically. Independence was now on the lips of everyone. And there was this, and if you look at Lumumba himself, his earlier writings were extremely mild and tepid. He was asking not for independence, but, could the Belgian administration make some small changes to make life better for Evolués and stuff like that? In 57, 58, the demands get louder and louder and more absolute. That is to say, we demand independence.
I suspect you remember this, that President Vicente Fox worked for Coca-Cola.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And that was one of the ways that he was able to meet so many people, and then became a high-level manager. But for a long time, he was just driving around in a truck around various parts of Mexico. So
I guess it's a tried and true route.
An odd similarity. So let's now jump to, because we have limited time, and I want to be sure that we spend enough time on the CIA's role. But fast forward about how quickly Congo's claim statement for independence went downhill.
Yeah. So in the Belgian government, long story short, finally realizes, okay, we need to give the Congolese their independence. Belatedly, they realized this, but by June 1960, that was when Congo was finally going to become independent, on June 30th. So there's this big ceremony. People from far and wide have come. Lumumba is prime minister, so between where we last left off, he co-founded this political party. He put himself forward as a parliamentary candidate, won the most votes, campaigned across Congo, and was now, upon independence, the country's prime minister. Within days, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. The army mutinies. You have an all-white officer corps, a holdover from colonialism. The black rank and file, understandably, mutiny against that. So you have a mass exodus of the white population of Congo, the Belgian population, including most of the people who sort of ran the country: air traffic control operators, doctors, teachers, technicians, all that expertise, which again was mainly Belgian because the Congolese had been so limited in their professional advancement. They fled. Then then a province seceded, Katanga, the mineral-rich province in the southeast. It announces that it's breaking off and wants nothing to do with Lumumba's chaotic Congo. It's going to go its own way. And then the Belgian military intervenes in what is now their former colony. They send in paratroopers across the country, ostensibly to rescue and protect their civilians.
And Stuart, I don't want you to lose your train of thought on that, but why was the breakaway republic important, Katanga?
It was the revenue producer for the country. So without Katanga, the country was broke, basically. That was the economic engine, because that was copper was mined there, and that was some big share of all tax revenues came from there. And there had been, there was also an ethnic dimension to that separatist movement there. So that breaks off. Belgium intervenes in its former colony. It looks like a recolonization. And in that, so the country's falling apart, couldn't be worse. Lumumba sends a desperate telegram to the United Nations asking it for help. And the United Nations under Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General, sort of rises to the occasion and sends in this massive peacekeeping operation.
But at that time, was Lumumba also trying to get close to the United States and, as we'll talk about, the Soviet Union? Because I think what's so important about your book, and you and I talked about that earlier this week, is that you can cherry pick articles and books, and Lumumba comes across as a great freedom fighter, Democrat, or you can look at other viewpoints, and he comes across as someone that's really a stooge of the Soviet Union. And neither is true.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was a surprise to me was really, frankly, how pro-American Lumumba was. If you sort of shove aside all the commentary about him and actually look at the man's own words and actions, let me give you some examples. And one thing I should note, so he calls in the UN and that operation doesn't go well and he's frustrated. So he flies to the United States, Washington, D.C. and New York. In Washington, he goes to the State Department. He asks for American help. He wants a plane. He wants economic investment. He even, at a press conference, calls on the United States to send in troops to Congo. So think about that. If Lumumba's often called a communist, pro-Soviet. He's asking for American troops to come to his country, not a particularly pro-Soviet thing to do. What happens, though, is the Americans sort of rebuff him, and he doesn't get what he wants. The UN's not helping put his country together. The United Nations is giving him the cold shoulder. And so what does he do? Who does he turn to? The Soviet Union. And that proved to be a fatal mistake.
But when you look at his visit to the United States, again, there's that racism that you see among some of the white male in Yale, people at the State Department or elsewhere. I mean,
yeah, I mean, that was a real theme. You can see it, and it's undeniable in the cables and reports. There's the American and especially the Belgian attitude toward the Congolese was that they were children, basically. And so they couldn't be trusted. They were, rubes who didn't know what they were doing. And, the US ambassador to Congo in a private letter of his I found at his archives is joking about how Lumumba is a cannibal, probably. So that's the mentality that many of these people had at the time. And how did that manifest in actual policy? I think it, in a few ways. One, it created this sense that the Congo was an uncivilized place where bad, violent things happen, and that was just the way of life. And so it allowed the US to be party to and to permit a lot of horrendous things, some of which we'll get to. And then also this racist undercurrent sort of created the sense that therefore the United States has to meddle because they can't take care of their own problems, so we're going to bribe this or that senator, we're going to intervene. It was not treating them as sovereign equals. And of course, beyond racism, there's just the Cold War context, which is probably the most important factor motivating US policy at the time.
What type of disagreement was there among the various key players and institutions at that time? And I'm thinking largely of the White House, the CIA, State Department, and the United Nations. Because Eisenhower was, of course, president at this point, and he, as you said, he was sort of tired. So he really wanted hands off, but there was a lot of disagreement among the other institutions, right?
Yeah, well, I would say at first there wasn't. Well, to answer your question, so the American parts of that, the State Department, the White House, the CIA, I think really the CIA was taking the lead on Congo policy at a certain point. That's why when the CIA documents were finally declassified, only then did historians get the true picture of what had happened, because they were running the show in Congo. Specifically, Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief in Leopoldville, was the most important American there at the moment. He was the one that had the close relationship with Mobutu, who I'm sure we'll get to in a second. Now, the UN, that's an interesting case because, remember in Korea, the UN was basically a vehicle for US policy because the Soviets had boycotted the meeting where everything happened. And in Congo originally, the US and the UN had very similar goals and there was no disagreement. Over time, that diverged, in part because what happened in 1960 was all these African nations joined the UN. And so the UN had become much more amenable. I mean, of course, there were the Soviets to contend with, but with these new African and Asian countries, that opinion suddenly had to be attended to. So, there were many more votes in the UN General Assembly, and it became a much more of a forum for the entire world, including the third world, rather than a vehicle for American policy.
And there were so many countries that became independent in that 1959, 1960 period as well. We're getting some questions, and folks, may I ask you to put your questions into the Q&A box and not the chat. You'll have a much better chance of having your question asked if you do that. But Martha, I am going to ask your question here. And Martha asks, was there Western involvement in the Katanga breakaway? And if so, why?
There was Belgian involvement for sure. And why? There were a lot of Belgian commercial interests there. That was where all the mines were. And, upon independence, they were still run by Belgians and largely owned by Belgians. But also that became what the Belgians viewed as their last toehold of stability in the country. The leader there of that breakaway province, Moise Tshombe, was very cozy with Belgian interests. He, basically was, he was in bed with them, and so Katanga was seen as like the last hold. Okay, the rest of Congo is falling apart, and they all hate us, but at least we have this one part, and it's the part that produces all the money. It also had a fairly large settler population. Belgium was compared with places like Kenya, for instance, it was not much of a settler colony. The Belgian population was relatively small in comparison to the ratio in other places, but there was a significant presence in Katanga.
Well, let's talk now about the UN, because this was what was the first time that armed UN soldiers, troops went in more than a peacekeeping mission. Take a minute or two and really tell us who Dag Hammarskjöld was.
So he was the Swedish bureaucrat who, to everyone's surprise, was named Secretary General in 1953. There he is meeting with Lumumba in July 1960, and it says October, but it's July. And
my bad.
No worries. And what's interesting in this picture, in a way, they look like they're on great terms and actually getting along well, but the picture is very deceiving. They had just had days of meetings when this photo was taken, and they disagreed on absolutely everything. Lumumba wanted the UN troops to come into Katanga, that breakaway province. Dag Hammarskjöld didn't want to send the UN troops in because he was afraid that would, kick off a regional war where the Katangan forces would be fighting and killing the UN soldiers. So they disagreed on everything substantive. And then also at a sort of stylistic level, they really clashed. Dag Hammarskjöld was diplomatic. He was very intentional, legalistic, formal. Lumumba was sort of more all over the place, try one thing, try another. He was a man in a hurry. I mean, his country was falling apart. He didn't have much time. And so they really clashed at both the substantive and stylistic level. But what the UN was trying to do in Congo was something, as you mentioned, Jim, that it had never done before, which is it had done sort of monitoring a truce here and there, but never before had it been responsible for bringing order to an entire country that was in the midst of chaos. And so 15,000, maybe even more than that, peacekeepers were eventually sent. It was this multinational force, mostly composed of African nations, independent African nations, but also the Americans and the British and the Soviets were helping with the airlift. There were Norwegian, all sorts of countries. And it was this really idealistic
Who commanded
project.
the troops?
There's a Swedish commander named General von Horn, who was, everyone agreed he was totally ineffective, and he ended up being sort of fired and shoved to the side. But this is a good opportunity to mention someone who I always feel like gets short shrift in U.S. history and should be more well known, which is Ralph Bunche, the great American diplomat. And he was the head of the UN operation in Congo. He had been sent to the independence ceremonies by Dag Hammarskjöld, and then when the chaos broke out, he was in charge of the mission. And he was, this one of the most prominent African American people in public life, and worked for the UN and the highest ranking American in the UN.
And did he, am I mistaken, did he win the Nobel Peace
He
Prize?
did, yeah, for negotiating with topical Israeli Arab dispute.
And I don't know if I can find the quote, but I'm sure you'll remember it. He had health difficulties and wrote his wife frequently, and he said working here was like trying to corral rattlesnakes or something like that. He
Giving
said.
aid to a wounded rattlesnake. I think the idea being that you're trying to help, but they fight you.
So we have a comment and question from Cora Gaster. Isn't the situation with Lumumba like the situation with Castro, insofar that America and the UN refusal practically pushed Lumumba into the arms of the Soviet Union, very much like with Ho Chi Minh, who was at first a nationalist, not a communist? Interesting perspective.
I think there's some truth to that. And one different way of putting it is that the US government had a pretty hard time understanding third world nationalism. And so, because that often was aligned with communists, and the communists certainly wanted everyone to think that they were the ones that had the third world on their side, that caused a lot of problems of perception. I don't know enough, frankly, about the specifics of the Vietnamese and Cuban cases to say anything meaningful there. But in Congo, certainly that was the case. US officials sort of viewed everything through Cold War lenses, and every action Lumumba took was sort of interpreted in the most sinister way possible, when he himself, as he said many times in his own words, that he was not communist, he wasn't pro-Soviet, he just wanted help getting his country back together. And so when the Americans said no, that was when he asked the Soviets for military aid.
Excuse me, what was the term he used? What, neutralism? Was it?
Positive neutralism is how he put it. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's something, non-aligned, that sort of policy.
Well, let's now bring in some of the villains, and that would be the station chief, Larry Devlin. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how did he end up being station chief and such a key player in all of this?
Yeah, another fascinating character. So Larry Devlin was born and raised in San Diego, fought in World War II, and then went to Harvard after the war to get a graduate degree, and was recruited into the CIA, one wintry afternoon in a professor's office. Joined the CIA, was sent to Europe. His original cover was as a travel writer for photos, which was a great cover for a CIA officer, because you could travel all over Europe. You could take photos, take notes, draw bridges in your notebook or whatever. He was then stationed in Brussels, not as a travel guide writer, but as under official cover, pretending to be a US Embassy employee there. And then in 1960 was assigned to be the station chief in Congo. And it's telling that he was 37 or 38 years old, had never served in Africa besides when he actually went there during the war as a soldier. But they put this untested man in the Belgian Congo because this was a sleepy colony. No one expected that it was going to be a Cold War hotspot whatsoever. So when chaos breaks out, Larry Devlin suddenly finds himself in the most important posting in the world.
So when you look at the relationship that he built with Lumumba, did they have at one point a true friendship, or was it always intelligence officer and client? And how was it that the relationship, which from my reading of your book in the beginning was cooperative, broke apart?
So,
fractured.
well, this is a good time to just quickly introduce Mobutu, who was Lumumba's protege and right-hand man. And then after the mutiny, Lumumba puts his friend Mobutu in charge of the military. And that is a pivotal decision in history. And Devlin had met Mobutu in Brussels once in early 1960. He then ran into him in the street one time sometime in July during the chaos. And then in September 1960, and I'll try and compress things and keep it pretty simple here, but Lumumba's prime minister, he then gets sort of fired by the president with American help, and he's no longer technically in power. Into that void steps Mobutu, who is head of the army, announces that he's taking control, launching a military coup, although he announced it by saying this is not a military coup, but it was. So Mobutu, though, in the previous days, right before this coup, had gotten to know Devlin, and they had had a series of meetings where Devlin, as he would later admit, gave a green light to Mobutu to launch this coup, and even handed him a briefcase of $5,000. So that was the beginning of a very long relationship. As to your question, I think it did become friendly. I mean, they were on a first name basis with one another, and they remained in touch through the 1970s. And I believe even then they were Larry and Joseph to each other. So they were, I think a lot of bonds were forged in this crisis moment that would last a long time.
Any idea how much money exchanged hands from the CIA to Mobutu?
I wish we knew, but that is one of the things that is largely still classified. So it's baffling to me, but the documents will have redactions over people's names and then dollar amounts often, which I don't know why it's still a secret whether the CIA gave Mobutu, $200,000 or $300,000, but
a lot
millions.
of those people are still alive.
Not many.
Well, many of the people who were in the CIA at the time who worked with Mobutu, some of them are still alive, I believe.
I think, they'd probably be in their 90s by now.
90s, yeah, but it's very interesting. One of the things about Mobutu is I always pictured him as being very strong, despot, dictator. But in your book, you talk about how, at least in his younger years with Lumumba, he was pretty fragile.
Yeah, that was another total surprise to me researching this book. He took power in this coup and then sort of immediately regretted it and was perseverating and, telling people he regretted doing it and might just sort of undo it and tell everyone never mind. Devlin was worried about him. Mobutu went to a doctor for help with his anxiety. He lost a bunch of weight. He was drinking too much whiskey. He was really racked with guilt and nervousness, and the press called him the Hamlet of the Congo because he sort of couldn't make up his mind. Only later did he become the colorful leopard hat wearing dictator we would all come to know. But even then, and I think you're right that he did become a much more confident person, but in a weird way, his style of rule was through weakness, not strength. And it was sort of, he was constantly paying off different interests, not really ruling with an iron fist. It was more chaos than like totalitarianism.
And for such a long time, the United States supported Mobutu. We're going to try to bring up a picture of Mobutu with all different poses with the U.S. presidents. Great job, Abby. I mean, really quite something to see that. And for those in Santa Fe, there you see our own former governor, Ambassador Bill Richardson. So Murad asked this question. Writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Jean-Claude Williams believe that Lumumba's lack of political experience and character contributed to his death. Would you agree with that view?
I think that's, first of all, it's important to be, sometimes people have asked me, didn't Lumumba deserve to die? And like, no, is my clear answer to that question. Did it contribute to it? Yes, he was, I say in the book that he was Congo's best politician and its worst statesman. And what I mean by that, he was, extremely energetic, charismatic, inspiring, but in terms of managing the situation and handling also the Cold War politics, he made some errors. It's also important to point out he was up against incredible odds. He was facing, conspiracies of people trying to undermine him at every turn. So it was not an easy job, but he definitely he rubbed Western diplomats. I'll say that he rubbed Western diplomats the wrong way. He changed tack very quickly. He would defend it as adapting to the situation, but others saw it as erraticism and unreliability. He did have political experience, though, or as much political experience as one could have in a colony. He was a political, had co-founded a political party, had served as the head of many different associations. So I wouldn't say it was his political inexperience necessarily, although maybe, if you think of that as experience actually in office, but maybe it was really his personality in a way that contributed to the misunderstanding.
Why weren't the Soviets at the time more supportive? Did they miss an opportunity?
They didn't have much of an opportunity because at that point, 1960, relatively early in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was much weaker than it would become. Projecting power far away in the middle of Africa was not something you could do easily, even just at a logistical level. To get overflight rights, that was much harder for the Soviets than it was for the Americans to send planes there. They were making all sorts of bumbling errors. They sent a ship of wheat to the Congo, but there were no mills to turn into flour in Congo. They sent bananas, which was a top export. So they were not sophisticated operators in Congo. They viewed it as this distant place where maybe they could score some propaganda victories, but it was not, as we know from when the Soviet archives opened, an area that they thought they could really get much advantage in. And they viewed Lumumba as sort of just as unreliable as the Americans did.
So let's get to the assassination. There's so many notes, so many files about this. Was the assassination approved at the highest level? And by that, I mean the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, either by, I don't know about it, keep me in the dark, or did he sign off on it?
So there are two separate things we need to talk about. One is the assassination plot that involved poison that ultimately fizzled out and was not what killed Lumumba. And so and I'll talk briefly about that. Eisenhower is fed up with Lumumba. At an August 18th, 1960 meeting of the National Security Council, he says something, we don't know the exact words, they're lost to history, but he says something to the effect of, will no one rid me of this troublesome prime minister, and looks at Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA. And we know this because a note taker at the meeting would later testify before the church committee all about this, saying, I'll never forget this. The room was stunned into silence when Eisenhower suggested this. So that's where you have the highest level, presidential instructions to Dulles to kill Lumumba. And we also know that happened because of what happened next. Dulles sets in motion this crazy operation involving poison that is flown to Congo, given to Larry Devlin, the station chief.
Did I ask you to read about that? Is this a good time to do it?
Yeah.
Because I think
I'll just say
book.
One more thing, and then I'll get to that. So they want Devlin to put poison in Lumumba's toothpaste. Devlin stalls and can't get access to Lumumba's house. Lumumba's under house arrest. And so the CIA, it's almost sort of fun in a black humor way, reading these cables today, because the CIA was clearly frustrated with, hey, what's up with this assassination operation? Why didn't you respond to our last cable? What's going on? Give us an update. And so what they do is they send a CIA officer, a man named Justin O'Donnell, to Congo to try and speed things up and get this assassination operation off the ground. The Leopoldville, so O'Donnell goes to Congo. The Leopoldville station needed someone who couldn't be traced back to the United States, someone who had little regard for personal safety, someone who would do as he was told without asking questions, and above all, someone who had no moral scruples. The CIA had just the man. It had recruited André Mankel years earlier after the Luxembourg native and former member of the French resistance was caught illegally exporting nickel past the Iron Curtain. The CIA station in Luxembourg valued Mankel's connections to the criminal underworld and hired him, assigning him the codename QJ Win. Now, with O'Donnell in need of a French-speaking asset with few ethical hang-ups, the Luxembourg station agreed to lend him out. Mankel was told he would be heading to Dakar, Senegal, and was sent to Frankfurt to learn more. Mankel, tall, thin, and jug-eared, knew to show up in the lobby of the Hotel Carlton in downtown Frankfurt at 2 p.m. on November 2nd. He had been instructed to look for a fat, red-faced man smoking a cigar and wearing tortoiseshell glasses. It was O'Donnell. Both parties knew the script in advance. "Are you the salesman from Luxembourg?" O'Donnell asked. "Yes, I am the Arbed representative," Mankel replied, naming a Luxembourg steel producer. Their identities confirmed, O'Donnell revealed to Mankel that his true destination would not be Dakar, but Leopoldville. The details of the mission were kept vague, but Mankel was informed that it would involve a high degree of personal risk and pay $1,000 a month. He agreed. He stayed behind in Frankfurt to get his immunizations and travel documents in order while O'Donnell flew to Africa. In Leopoldville, O'Donnell met Devlin, who told him there was a, quote, virus in his safe. Devlin didn't spell out the pathogen's purpose, but O'Donnell thought, quote, "I knew it wasn't for somebody to get his polio shot up to date." Freeing Devlin from the additional workload, O'Donnell began work on a plan to lure Lumumba out of the Prime Minister's residence. He looked into renting an observation post near the house and befriended one of the UN guards. But after 10 days, Mankel had yet to arrive, and the station cabled Washington, asking for the immediate expedition of QJ Win's travel. So that's sort of the almost comic Cold War spy aspect of this, that they can't assassinate Lumumba with toothpaste, so they hire this shady European criminal to help speed things along. And yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
So we had a question or two about what was the assassination plot, and we know that that plot was not successful. We unfortunately don't have a lot of time, but bring us to how Lumumba did die.
Yeah, so he's under house arrest. He escapes house arrest. He's captured by Mobutu, who has help from the CIA in capturing him.
Now, where was he? Where he was under
in
house
Leopoldville,
okay,
in the capital. Mobutu decides, okay, we're not going to let this happen again, and so he sends. He puts Lumumba in a military prison, and then eventually sends him to Katanga, where everyone knows Lumumba is going to die. And this is Lumumba at the airport in Leopoldville after he's captured, gets roughed up, tortured. And then a short while later, he's sent on a plane to the breakaway province of Katanga. Now there's a big CIA role here that my book focuses on quite a bit, which is that Devlin essentially gave a green light for Mobutu to send Lumumba away. So Mobutu, the military leader, Devlin is informed that they're about to get rid of Lumumba and send him somewhere that everyone knows he'll die. Devlin doesn't tell Mobutu to stop it, which is essentially a green light in that context. They were intimately involved in everything. And he also keeps his superiors in Washington out of the loop because he was afraid, this was the transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy, he was afraid that headquarters would tell him to put in the brakes and say, oh, actually, Kennedy's about to come in. We can't have any big movements happening in the Congo. So Lumumba's flown to Katanga and killed shortly after, hours after landing there by the local forces, separatist soldiers answering to their Belgian officers. That province still had Belgian officers who in turn were answering to the separatist government. So there's a lot of different actors in the mix, but there is this very clear American role.
Was Devlin in any way punished for not being forthright with Langley?
To the contrary, I think that cable only came out. It was in the Church Committee investigation. It was only made public much later. But he was rewarded for the Congo operation because it was viewed as a success. In this Cold War context, America had ridded itself of this potentially pro-Soviet leader and installed a pro-American military ruler. What was not to like about that? So it was viewed as a success within the agency. Devlin won an award. He got promoted. That was the official take on it.
So when you look at the Church report, was the Congo situation and the plot, was that raised as one of the most critical mistakes, or was it sort of glossed over and more attention to Castro and other attempted assassinations?
In a way, it was one of the most sensational because it did have this poison plot. But because that poison plot ultimately petered out and nothing came of it, the CIA, or the Church Committee, let the CIA off the hook. They did not focus on the role I just discussed about sort of greenlighting it, nor, we haven't even talked about this, but the constant undermining of Lumumba, the paying of street protesters, bribing senators. It was, Lumumba's removal and death was a long process, and the CIA was involved at every stage of it, really.
Talk about how we bribed people in the UN.
Yeah, that was shocking to me too. The bribery was happening not only in Congo, but also in the General Assembly. So the CIA set up this this little fake office in New York that pretended to be consultants. They were actually in charge of bribing delegates at the UN, saying, okay, switch your vote to do this because there's a big vote on Congo and the Americans wanted it to go a certain way. And so they were handing literally suitcases of cash over to delegates. So, and it's funny, you can see, because of the way the UN votes worked, where there were multiple votes on the same issue over time, you can sort of see which countries flipped. And on Monday, Mexico voted this way, but then on Wednesday, they voted another way. So that was a really undermining of, the UN. It's supposed to be this forum for the world, and America was bribing the delegates.
So I bet people are wondering if I'm going to ask you about the plane crash that killed Dag Hammarskjöld. We're not going to go in too much detail because I want people to to read your book, but that's a great story. But where do you come out in the end on that?
Yeah, so Dag Hammarskjöld died in a plane crash that remains unsolved, en route to ceasefire negotiations in Congo. It was September 1961. Lumumba died in January 1961. And there have been many conspiracy theories over the years. Many of them are mutually exclusive and both can't be true. I'm pretty skeptical of them, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think that planes crashed in 1961 all the time due to pilot error. And so Occam's razor suggests that the most likely explanation is pilot error. And there's evidence that is consistent with that. I also admit that it's, at this point, truly unknowable. It's just been too long. Everyone's looked at the same evidence, basically. And so we'll never really know for certain, but I would take the conspiracy theories with a grain of salt. In part because there's never been a good answer to the question of why.
I know from my brief experience in that part of the world, planes crashed a lot back in those days.
Absolutely.
So as we wind down, how is Lumumba viewed in the Congo and in Belgium?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's largely in Congo today. He's viewed as a national hero, although that's not a universally held opinion. There are many people, still in Katanga to this day, who are no fans of him. But he has become, sort of for better or worse, the father of independence. And there you can see a statue of him in Kinshasa, which is actually now where there's his tooth was returned. So his tooth was the only part of him that remained. The Belgian kept it as a souvenir, and that has been now laid to rest at where that statue is in Kinshasa.
Yeah, I thought that picture was a little too grisly to include. That was quite sad.
Yeah. And in Belgium, I think Belgium, like many other European countries, like America and race, is sort of undergoing its own belated reckoning. And there are a lot of Congolese in Belgium to this day. But I hope my book sort of, what I wanted to do in part was recover Lumumba the man, because he was, he became a symbol and so polarizing. And I just wanted to know, who was he, what did he do, and what did he think?
Well, let me give the last question to Ray Termini, who's a member of both Global Santa Fe and the World Affairs Council of Dallas. And he may be one or two other World Affairs Councils too. So Ray, you get the last question. Did the CIA's covert activities in the Congo during the 1960s achieve any developments that were consistent with democratic values?
That's an easy one. No, I would say. Why? They were bribing members of parliament. They were propping up a military ruler, an illegal, unconstitutional regime. When there was a big political conference to have a new government and try and have a legitimate regime with a prime minister, Larry Devlin was sneaking in cash through the sewer tunnels to get in. So the theme of 1960s in Congo is supporting Mobutu. He was unpopular. He was not representative of any political strain in Congo. So that was a decision that U.S. policy, a decision that the United States made in the Cold War context, and it had decades of ramifications for Congo.
Well, Stuart, people often say that I'm always saying how much I enjoy books. Well, the books where I interview the author, and fortunately, most of the time I get to pick who I want to talk with. And your book really is just tremendous. Order it now from your independent bookstore in your communities. And good luck on your book tour. And thanks so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions. This was really fun.
Good night, everybody.